The Nameless and the Faceless of the Civil War, Gettysburg, Manassas, and more, is the third book in the Nameless and Faceless series. The prior two books are The Nameless and Faceless of the Civil War and Nameless and Faceless Women of the Civil War. Both of those books earned me Artist in Residence through the National Parks Arts Foundation, National Park Service, Gettysburg Poetry, September 2020, and Artist in Residence through the National Park Service, Manassas, Virginia Poetry, October 2021. The books are a collection of 28 poems and 28 historical essays on the Civil War. We know that not everyone who witnessed and experienced the Civil War made it into the his books. And what of all those unknowns? By combining the rhyme and narrative of poetry with Civil War history, a lost voice of the past comes forth to share their experiences and their suffering. A place where the humanity of history and the songs of their souls come together to create a deeper understanding of those lost and unknown. There's no north or south in these collections. And I'm sure you're going to say, what? There's no slave states, there's no border states, no governance of politics. And why is that? It is my belief that suffering has no boundaries because it affected everyone. The narrator in most of these poems is recounting a historical scene of the Civil War. Represented here are soldiers, both North and South, civilians, doctors, nurses, political figures. In some instances, the narrator in the poem is identified. This was done to bring awareness to some unknowns, and in some instances also a couple of well-known individuals as well. And these poems give a place to tell their tales of compassion, of life, of death, agony, and grief, as a reminder to the world that they did not die in vain. In this collection, we're going to hear from an unknown Confederate soldier who was lay dying in the basement of the Lutheran Seminary after the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st through 3rd, 1863. Sees the basement door open and raises his hand as to bring attention to his plight. The woman's name is, and the inspiration for this poem, Sarah Broadhead. The Stone House, which is located at Manassas National Battlefield Park in Manassas, Virginia. This stone sentinel reveals its legacy to the soldiers of the First and Second Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run. My Brother Jacob is a story of two unknown brothers from Virginia who joined the Confederacy together from the start of the war, but only one would survive the Battle of Gettysburg. The inspiration from that poem is also from two brothers of history who fought for the Confederacy, Colonel William C. Oates and his brother John A. Oates of the 15th Alabama. Both brothers would find themselves fighting at Little Round Top on July 2nd, 1863. Only one of those brothers would survive. And then to Anne Annis, one of only two women to survive the sinking of the Sultana on the Mississippi River near Memphis, Tennessee on April 27, 1865, and who witnessed the death of her husband and small daughter. The bodies of her husband and daughter would never be found. This event marked the worst maritime disaster in American history. Then to the missing soldiers office in the poem, Can You Help Me, I asked. In 1865, Clara Barton would open a missing soldiers office in Washington, D.C. The office was open from March of 1865 to 1868 to help locate the soldiers who had fallen in battle and were missing. At times, there were 150 letters a day pouring into her office, totaling over 60,000, and she and her staff would identify and locate 22,000. A tremendous accomplishment, but what of all those other soldiers? Are they still nameless and faceless? Then to the Summer Kitchen and the George Spangler Farm, Gettysburg, July 5th, 1863. In this poem, we hear the voice of Confederate Brigadier General Lewis A. Armistead. General Armistead was mortally wounded on July 3rd, 1863, at the Angle or Bloody Angle, after a failed assault on the Union line as part of Confederate General George Pickett and Pickett's charge. His story is a story of the day of battle ending, only to die on July 5th, 1863. And finally, to rise up, all ye Manassas rise. This poem was inspired by my time as an artist in residence at Manassas National Battlefield Park. This poem is for all the lost and unknown of our Civil War. We shall begin. The basement. It was so frightfully hot on those early July days. Gettysburg was the name. Oh, how the fighting raged. The fife, the drum, the cannon roar, marching in fours in our corps, the sound of fire, the battle din, our color bearer, our day to win. The artillery that I did see and feel that bended my knee and made me kneel. Yet I prayed, where are you, God on high? The creator, the one of love, so how I cried. I fired my musket and stood my ground. I had no choice with those people all around. For although I defended my home, my wife, my children there and all of my life, I tried to take cover, you see, up by the seminary it was to be. But the mini ball that struck me down leveled me right to the ground. I fell, and all that I could see, the soldiers fighting all around me. Then it became quiet from the fire, and the sound of the wounded, it was so dire. I could not speak, I could barely breathe. I crawled to find cover anywhere you see. A day or two went by, I am not sure, and found myself on a basement floor. I was not alone, I barely had room for the pile of soldiers in all this gloom. The moans and the bloodshed that echoed within became even louder as the rains began, and soon our haven filled. Those souls you see began to drown in the filth and debris. My breath was fading, my wounds too great, when the basement door opened and I saw her face. With my last ounce of strength, I reached out my arm. I cried, help me, take me from harm. There were so many of us in that basement, you see, too many wounded with no one to plead. Then the pain that had drained the life from me began to ebb and set me free. The woman came towards me and began to fade from sight. I was leaving this place to the Almighty's might. There were no more sounds of cries and such. The white light came for me and I felt his touch. And as I began to ascend from this death place, my comrades were with me, blessed by his grace. Sarah Broadhead. This is from the Diary of a Lady of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, from June 15th, July 15th, 1863. Battle of Gettysburg. Yes, history recounts the Union and Confederate forces that converged on the rolling farmlands and town of Gettysburg for 3 days, July 1st through 3rd, 1863. The most horrific of battles raged between these massive forces, leaving in its wake a Union victory shrouded by the wounded, the dead, and the missing. The estimated total of casualties for both Union and Confederacy will be over 55,000. But those are military history numbers. How about the perspective from this inhabitant, Sarah Broadhead? She was a resident during that great battle, and she was in her early 30s in the year of 1863. She was married to her husband, Joseph, had a little girl, Mary, 4 years old, and her home was on 217 Chambersburg Street, not far from this Lutheran seminary. And it was an entry that I read on July 8th, 1863, that was so extraordinary that while working and tending to the wounded there that had been converted into a hospital, she opened the door to the basement and described as such, quote, I found that I had only seen the lighter cases, and worse horrors met my eyes on descending to the basement of that building. Men wounded in 3 and 4 cases, not able to help themselves the least bit, lay almost swimming in water. I hunted the lady whom I had been helping and told her to come and see how they were situated. When we came down, she reverently explained, my God, they must be gotten out of this, or they will drown. She called some nurses to help, and getting some stretchers, the work began. There were some near 100 to remove to the 4th floor of that building. I have visited the Seminary Ridge. Now it's a museum. And it was this one representation, the basement, and Sarah Broadhead, and the dying soldiers represented, that compelled me to write the poem of this one unknown soldier. It's to wonder Then, of all the unknowns in that basement, like this Confederate one, lost to history, no name and no face, yet now given a voice to tell his story from the despair and agony during and after the Battle of Gettysburg, and this incredible courage and compassion shown by an ordinary citizen and many like her, the citizen whose name was Sarah Broadhead. The Stone House. I have stood here in the very spot since about the 1840s or so. A stony silence to history, you know. Yet there was one more that came to this very place. July of 61, it was of such haste. Before then, I will plainly state that my walls house a tavern of sorts, I do avow. But then on that hot, late July afternoon, I could not believe soldiers fighting each other. Oh, this must deceive. I stood here as the cannon did fire and roll like thunder. It was so dire. Drum beats and battle cries to advance the line. It was a sight that would live forever in time. The shelling, the firing did pierce my walls as the wounded Union came to my halls. And I cannot, but yet will try to tell you of that agony, of that day gone by, consumed by tragedy. The wounded Federals filled every space, to even the mudded floor in the basement place. Blood seeped through the boards on every floor and fell upon those too injured for more. It would be a victory for the Confederacy, you see, yet many more battles there would be. So now I must tell you again this tale, when the second battle, Manassas, did not fail. Yet another victory, August of 62, more death and destruction that did anew. And of two soldiers I came to hold for all time, for their names are carved in the upstairs pine. Two wounded Union from the 5th New York Infantry. Privates they were, and they came to me. One named Charles E. Brett, the other Eugene P. Greer. While in convalescence, they carved their names on the floorboards where they still remain. Eugene would later die after leaving my walls, September 30th in Georgetown Hospital, it was called. Charles would live on till 1909, a life filled with such illness unkind. So here I have stood, and here I remain, a stony sentinel to history I frame. So I remind you as you all leave, to remember those who came and lived and died between these walls. So how I cried. The history of the stone house at Manassas National Military Park in Manassas. In several instances while writing my poetry, I give a voice to the sentinels of war, such as a witness tree, using the voice of Mother Earth, child's doll, and in this poem, the stone house. These stone sentinels of our Civil War past dot the landscape of our battlefields and hold in their own stories in their brick and mortar within their very walls. And they are truly silent witnesses to our past. And it was actually during the Second Battle of Manassas that two wounded Union soldiers, again, Eugene P. Geer and Charles Brem, both of this 5th New York Infantry, found their way into one of the upstairs rooms of the stone where they carved their names into the floorboards. Brem survived, but Geer died of his wounds. And you can see here one of the individuals, Mr. Brem. You can see his name carved there. I have been very fortunate to present my poetry in the Stone House and to see the carvings of Mr. Geer and Mr. Brim. And it was the knowledge of what transpired there during the battles of First and Second Manassas or Bull Run that truly inspired me not only to this poem, but through my time as artist in residence and continues to do so. When I go and I visit Manassas National Battlefield Park, the Stone House is always the first place I go to. From the first time I saw it until this day and up into my residency, it remains a very special place for the lost and unknown of the Civil War. My brother Jacob. I will tell you a story right here and now of my brother Jacob, I do avow. You see, it was the spring of '61 when first we knew secession had rung. And my younger brother Jacob, you see, sprang to enlist to defend Virginia, if ever be. I will never forget his fervor and such. Asked me to join him, it was too much. For you see, it was me and him and my ma at home. My pa done died. It was just us alone. My poor ma, she took me aside and told me with all of her pride, see here, Caleb, as the oldest of my sons, I don't want you to go either. God's will, thy will be done. But go you must, but for the reason I give, watch out for your brother, help him live. For 'tis you we always relied, and this too I'm afraid we must abide. Not to worry about me, my son, she said with a smile. I'll be waiting for you both. I'll be here a while. And so you must go, you must defend our little farm here to the very end. With that said, Jacob and I took our leave. The last sight of my ma caused me to grieve. And in battles that we stayed true, Manassas, Antietam, Fredericksburg, to name a few. Jacob and I, well, we stayed together every time, shoulder to shoulder, it would us find. And after 2 years' time in the battles that bled, comrades killed, so much bloodshed, that Jacob and I did survive, you see. But it was Gettysburg that would consume me. It was day 3 on this impossibly hot day. I was with Jacob in the tree line with Virginia, I say, waiting for our commander, General Pickett, to order us men into the battle and out into the glen. To march in the open field about a mile or so, they say, to face the Union artillery along the way. I turned to Jacob as we waited to go. I told him, stay close, brother, for I know this day's battle, I believe, will bring much sorrow, I fear, for all of us men and our loved ones' tears. Jacob smiled at me with his usual grin, said, come on, brother, we will win. Then the silence was sliced with the battle din and roar, as General Pickett did state it was for. Remember, men, you are from old Virginia, I heard him say. And so the drums of battle ordered us on our way. Not a sound from the ranks was heard, only the beating drums that was stirred. And so we marched, Jacob right by my side. I wanted to grab him, to run and to hide. For in that moment, great explosions were around. The Union cannon was the most deafening sound, and great groans and cries from the men as one by one they disappeared from the glen. And yet we kept marching, kept going, you see, to the copse of trees where the Union they be. Then it seemed all of my life stopped in this place, a great blast to me, hot to my face. I must tell you, I don't remember what happened then. I woke up and lay there, for what or how long or when. I realized as I raised my head the battle was over, so many dead in fields of sweet clover. I carefully inspected myself to be sure I was all right, only knocked out in this horrific fight. I rose to my feet and panic struck my heart. Where was Jacob? I could not part. It was then I spied him very near a group of the dead. I went to roust him and move away from this hotbed. I knelt beside him, knocked out like me. I cried, Jacob, come on, follow me. Wake up, it's time to go. We will fight another battle, this I know. I don't know how long I tried to revive my brother on that field. Only when the ambulance came and told me to yield, my brother's body to be buried post haste, no time to mourn, no time to waste. My blood froze even through the blazing heat. My brother's body was at my feet. They're going home, not for him. I cried and I cried in the haze and the din. I thought of my ma and the promise I could not keep. I tried, ma, to keep him safe, I said, and did weep. But God had other plans for him. This we prayed not to see. For your sweet boy Jacob, ma, he was not meant to be. Brothers Colonel William C. Oates and Lieutenant John A. Oates, CSA, 15th Alabama, Battle of Gettysburg, July 2nd, 1863. The inspiration for the poem, My Brother Jacob, is born from what many families must have experienced during the Civil War. In this instance, an unknown pair of brothers fighting alongside one another and who started out together in the first battle, the Battle of First Manassas or Bull Run in July of 1861. In this poem, two brothers unknown to history join together and fight until the Battle of Gettysburg, specifically Pickett's failed charge on July 3rd. It is on that battlefield where one lived and one died. And so how many other countless others met that fate? How many other countless brothers fought with each other where one lived and one died? Yet there is in Civil War history this one particular story of two brothers who fought together at Gettysburg. And again, one who died. And that's the story of Confederate Colonel William C. Oates and his younger brother, Lieutenant John A. Oates of the 15th Alabama. The 15th Alabama were heavily engaged during the Battle of Little Round Top on July 2nd, 1863. Defending the Union left was Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of the 20th Maine. Also present were the two Chamberlain brothers, Thomas, a lieutenant, and John, a volunteer with the Christian Commission. All three of these Chamberlain brothers would survive this battle. But Colonel Oates would survive, yet his younger brother John would die. William's grief at the loss of his brother John is haunting even to this day, where he writes, no brothers loved each other better. William wrote of John long after the battle. He could never forgive himself for leaving his wounded brother behind on the Gettysburg battlefield. Oates wrote to his son on Christmas Eve 1800 to tell how that night brought forth the perennial ache in his heart. He could feel nothing but sad over his fate. He wrote, adding, had he been killed outright, it would not have been so sad, but he fell into the hands of the enemy and died a prisoner of war. He concluded, he was a noble young man and died for his country and in a just cause, as he and I both saw it. You know, I have stood at the base of Little Round Top as well as the Little Round Top. You can see this is a photograph that I took while visiting Gettysburg National Military Park. It's an extraordinary feeling to stand where the 15th Alabama was and made their assault, and then stand in the place where Colonel Chamberlain and the 20th of Maine seized the day for the Union. And again, to remember where it is one brother, Colonel William C. Oates, would have to leave his brother John wounded and given to die on that battlefield. And Annis. The date was April 27, 1865, the day I shall never forget as I fought to survive. The sinking of the Sultana, though you may not know, the worst maritime disaster I cannot let go. For the papers said little and still the same today, yet I will tell you of the disaster that came my way. We boarded the ship Sultana, my husband and my little girl. A Union soldier, a lieutenant he was, my belle bright as a pearl. And we boarded in Vicksburg it was, and I saw the most grievous of sights, our freed Union prisoners of war's Hendersonville. God help them with all his might. Starved and broken they were, so many could not believe, and prayed in my heart that someone would pay for the sight my eyes did see. The steamboat, I said to my husband, was too overloaded for its means, with passengers and soldiers filling its seams. Up the Mississippi to Cairo was where we would land, and on to Wisconsin. Oh, so grand. But it was not meant to be as I tell you now of the heartbreaking event of April 27th, I vow. We were asleep in our cabin when it happened, I say, as we heard a loud noise that sent us into the fray. We opened the door and steam and fire abound, screams and hysteria all around. My husband took us to the stern where he tied a rope to the bridge and took Belle upon his back, and I followed, did cringe. They made their way to the water below as fire and death took hold. all around us and into the night, God help me, I did extol. I was descending upon the rope when I was felled upon from above by a man who jumped and landed atop me. I knew not where or thereof. I hung on to the rudder until the fire became too great. Another explosion filled the night and brought me to my fate. I know not how long or why, but I hung on to a board that was nearest me. I waited and prayed for rescue, you see. There were 2,000 and such souls on the Sultana that night. A steamboat whose capacity was 300 was not right. I lost my husband and my daughter Belle, as I remember plain. I see him sinking into the icy sea. With our daughter I do refrain. There be 1,500 of souls that perished in the flames. I was one of only 2 women who survived to tell you of my name. The story of the sinking of the Sultana is not so widely told. The death of John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Lincoln, the day before took hold. My name then is Annis, and you have heard my story now of the sinking of the Sultana and its death call. Remember this, I vow. The ill-fated journey of the Sultana on April 27th, 1865, home. The 4-letter word that must have sounded like manna from heaven for more than 1,960 former Union soldiers on board the steamship the Sultana. Many of these soldiers were former prisoners of war from the notorious Confederate prison camp, Andersonville, Georgia. On board the steamship Sultana in Vicksburg, where the voyage originated, were approximately 2,137 passengers. The ship was en route to St. Louis. The capacity of the Sultana was designed to hold 376 passengers, 85 crew members, and had been in operation in trade between New Orleans and St. Louis. But with so many on board, the steamship accommodations for food, sleeping arrangements, hygiene were almost non-existent. But it seemed like a small inconvenience to many of the soldiers who were going home. The disaster on the Mississippi on April 7th, 1865 was the worst maritime disaster in United States history, as 3 of the 4 boilers on the steamship exploded. Many of the victims were horribly burned from the explosion and fire and drowned in the cold, dark waters of the Mississippi. One such civilian on board that survived was Annis. She was on board the steamship with her husband Harvey and their 7-year-old daughter Isabella, and we hear from her. Mrs. Annis afterwards learned that the man and child were seen about the time they were nearing an eddy, and that soon the child fell off the door, and that when she sank, the man dove after her. The unfortunate woman, this is Mrs. Annis, believes that both husband and child were drowned at this point. The former had been in the army and, having been sick, was coming home with his at the time when the disaster occurred. He was consequently not very strong, and it is considered remarkable he braved his life as long as he did. The bodies of Lieutenant Harvey Annis and Isabel Annis were never recovered. Why is it, then, that this worst maritime disaster in United States history received what seems to have been a passing mention as a disaster Civil War event? What was going on in that month of April, 1865? Well, we know on April 9th, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant. The North won the Civil War. The Union was saved. And on April 14th, 1865, we know that President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. by John Wilkes Booth, Southern sympathizer and actor. And just the day before the sinking of the Sultana, April 26th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth was tracked down by the Union Army and killed in Port Royal, Virginia. April 27th, 1865, the Lincoln funeral train was moving through Erie, Pennsylvania to its final resting place in Springfield, Illinois. And again, it did receive notice. This was not on the front page. Shocking. And it just seems that the sinking of the Sultana was just one more disaster associated with the Civil War, and one too many because the war was over. By recounting the story of Aunt Annis, the story of the Sultana disaster comes to life. One must only remember the sight of the Sultana in Vicksburg and feel the exultation of those sick and exhausted soldiers who survived the ravages of Andersonville prison in Andersonville, Georgia, only to die horribly in the explosion of the Sultana. They saw the Sultana as their refuge, their passage home, home, home. That four-letter word that must have sounded like manna from heaven to them. Remember them here. Remember them now. Remember the Sultana. There's just one more part of the Sultana story that I would like to digress and share with you because it resonates so deeply within me. My journey with the nameless and faceless of the Civil War began with my researching the prisoner of war diary of a Union soldier, and his name was Michael Dougherty, late Company B, 13th Pennsylvania Cavalry. He was the sole survivor of 127 of his regiment captured the same time. 122 of them died in Andersonville. Michael kept a diary of his experiences in several Confederate prisons as Pemberton, Barracks, Libby. But it was the experiences and his writings of when he was a prisoner at Andersonville that was completely unbelievable. He would survive the horrific conditions of that prison and write of his experiences. And what he wrote was so egregious, it was his descriptions of suffering that prompted the collection, The Nameless of the Faceless in the Civil War, subsequent collections. 13,000 Union soldiers died at Andersonville. I have never forgotten his description of suffering and the suffering of countless more. Those without a name or a face, some who died in that prison and many other prisons, both Confederate and Union. So you see, I am tethered to the Sultana because of those soldiers in Andersonville prison. I will never forget. So again, remember them here and remember them now. Remember the story of the Sultana. Can you help me, I ask? Miss Clara Barton, can you help me, I ask? I heard your office in Washington is of that task. To locate our missing soldiers out in the field. I can't find him, I fear I shall yield. To the dread that has surrounded me, my missing son, I am on my knee. He joined the Union Army proud and bright to free our brethren in chains of might. In Petersburg, he fought at the crater, he wrote, a massacre of our soldiers from the Confederate revolt. I held my breath and waited to hear. Lord above, he survived that fear. He told me there would be a siege that lasted almost 9 months, I believe. It ended in March of 1865. Yet I have no word from my son, dead or alive. Miss Clara Barton, can you help me? I ask. I heard your office in Washington is of that task. To locate my son who fought for his country with such pride, I must locate him before I die. I have waited for word, so I bemoan. You see, a mourning dove is visiting my home. And it is said that when this dove appears in one's sight, a loved one has ascended to the Almighty in his light. And that I shall learn in the coming time. My son Henry, who is so sublime, fought for his country and his brethren, and would not see the freedom for his kin. Miss Clara Barton, can you help me, I ask? I heard your office in Washington is of that task. I am a mother like so many of those who sent their sons and lost lives untold, and know of the bloodshed that was spilled as they fought for freedom for our brethren and all that was wrought. Miss Clara Barton, can you help me, I ask, find my son? bring him home at last. Clara Barton in the missing soldier's office. This is an actual, what you're seeing here on the screen here is the actual sign that she had out on 7th Street in Washington, D.C. At her boarding house. While the story of Clara Barton and her selfless and tireless work as a nurse during the Civil War is widely known, she's also known for some very extraordinary efforts as well. After working on battlefields and in hospitals of the Civil War, Clara Barton found a new calling in the early months of 1865. As the conflict grew to a close, the 44-year-old war relief worker arrived in Annapolis, Maryland, where a transport of sickly Union prisoners arrived from the prison camps across the South. Working with the survivors, Ms. Barton became keenly aware of the need to provide information to the families of the missing soldiers. After she received approval from President Lincoln in March of 1865, she began the immense task of tracking down those who disappeared during the conflict. Without government-issued identification, fallen soldiers went missing at an alarming rate during the Civil War. And as I had said earlier, she received more than 60,000 letters, some 150 a day, and she was able to identify 22,000. But what of the remainder of them? When she closed the office in 1868, she and her team again had accomplished a tremendous feat. But here in this poem, can you help me, I ask? It's the voice of an unknown mother of a Union soldier desperate to find her son in the aftermath of the siege of Gettysburg, Virginia in the early months of 1865. This unknown mother, and perhaps thousands like her, were one of the 60,000 letters that could have been received by Clara Barton in the years after the Civil War. And again, while she and her staff were able to locate approximately 22,000 soldiers, what of those whose remains were never found? What of all those unknown soldiers who were never identified and lie in Civil War cemeteries under those headstones unknown? Perhaps it's one of those cemeteries where this unknown mother's son and thousands of other sons lie in these cemeteries. Yet here this unknown mother's voice calls to us to remember that although he is nameless and faceless, he is not lost and he is not forgotten. Can you help me, I ask? This question calls to us to this very day, as it did all those years ago. Oh, if only we could help her and reply, yes. The Summer Kitchen. July 3rd, 1863 was the date that the mini ball struck me. I had my division line up on Seminary Ridge to begin, to make the march to the battle din. Our artillery did bombard the Union, you see, up yonder away to the copse of trees. And when that barrage had ceased its last fire, our General George Pickett did lead us into the mire. And resolved to march that mile across to assault the Union at all cost. I stood there and prayed to our God above that my spirit was his to command and love. And so we marched across that field to the Union line that would not yield. And we kept marching throughout the Union artillery that did rout. Our line of brave Virginians that did seek that Union position, oh, we were not meek. But our line began to falter hither and fro as the artillery fire it did throw through our line of men that did mangle, yet we forged through to that angle. We did not break or panic, you see, until the fence on the Emmitsburg road it was known to be. And as we climbed and tossed over that fence, the Union artillery fire commenced. So many disappeared as we moved through, our brave soldiers in bayonet. Oh, we knew that this charge we would not give up until we reached the stone wall where the Union struck. And so we marched through canister, shot, and shell as I watched man after man that fell. We stalled for just a moment to regroup, you see, long enough to call to my men, if ever be. I took my hat and pierced it with my sword to lead my men as I roared. I shouted, "Give them the cold steel," and kept to the front to assault the Union at the angle we did affront, and breached that stone wall and tried to turn the cannon around to return fire upon them, yet we could not sustain the assault at the wall, yet I refrained. Then I was hit and fell to the ground. I was wounded like so many around, and spied from in my grievous pain. The retreat from the stone wall, we could not remain. I know not how long I did lay there, I state. The ambulance came to clear the field post haste. I was brought to a field hospital, you see. My wounds were mortal so as to be. It was moved to the summer kitchen at the Spangler farm, where I lay to die far, far from harm. Do not mourn me, do not weep, for we all must die and ne'er to keep. But my time was hastened by the mini ball, you see. I was just another casualty on July 3rd, 1863. The George Spangler Farm and the death of Confederate Brigadier General Lewis A. Armistead on July 5th, 1863. The number of casualties for both the North and South during and after the Battle of Gettysburg was staggering. Farms and houses all around Gettysburg were used as hospitals during and after the battle. Surgeons, doctors worked tirelessly to try to save the lives of the battle-torn soldiers, yet they were overwhelmed by the unceasing numbers that seemed endless. The George Spangler Farm lay just outside the battlefield, yet was pressed into service as the wounded poured into their home and farm. A Spangler surgeon who was approaching total exhaustion called the work too much for human endurance. At the doorway, I saw a huge stack of amputated arms and legs, a stack as high as my head, said Private William Southerton, age 21, 75th, Ohio. The most horrible thing I ever saw in my life. I wish I had never seen it. I sickened. The Spangler separate summer kitchen building and a small house were reserved for high priority patients. Confederate Brigadier General Lewis A. Armistead died in the summer kitchen on July 5th, 2 days after he was mortally wounded while leading his men across the wall at the end of Pickett's charge. And I just want to show you the bottom photo is the summer kitchen. It's a stone building. And the interior, if you can see that wall on the photo above it, that's the spot where General Armistead was brought right after the battle, where he passed away. I have walked across the open field, perhaps in the footsteps of General Armistead, to the position called the angle or the bloody angle, and stood at the spot again where General Armistead fell on July 3rd, 1863, and then traced his steps to the George Spangler Farm. My journey then took me to this summer kitchen that became the very inspiration for the poem. The brick and mortar structure with its large interior fireplace is also one of our Civil War stone sentinels. For within its walls is a story of the death of our Confederate General Lewis A. Armistead. And while history recounts the events of the Spangler Farm, its occupants, and the horror of the wounded during and after the battle, it is to this one lone structure that we acknowledge the loss of this one general. This stone sentinel holds within its very walls the lifeblood and death of a general so brave in battle. And it's very interesting because when you enter these very modest walls, it is truly to be instantly humbled by the event that took place there on July 5th, 1863. Rise up, all ye Manassas, rise. Rise up, all ye Manassas, rise, and take your place amongst the skies. For in these fields, among those unknowns, There are stories I know that are yet untold, whispers of valor and elan that you did make, stories of friendships you did not forsake. Rise up, all ye Manassas, rise, and take your place along God's side. These lush fields colored in magnificent green were once killing fields of the obscene, a battlefield where the country divided and fought, and now where unity shall forever be taught. Rise up, all ye Manassas, rise. I have heard your silent cries, whispers of those left behind without a name or a face. So many I know here in this place, names like the deep cut unfinished railroad to witness here and there, and the stone house, Henry Hill, filled with such despair. With each step across these hallowed grounds, be mindful a soldier may have found a final resting place too young to die, yet so many did, is how I cry. Rise up, all ye Manassas, rise. Your presence here is so fine. Just walk the stone bridge along the river bed, that one called Bull Run that long ago bled. Stop and listen to the forest sounds, and for a moment become one with them for all their sacrifice and so many men. Rise up, all ye Manassas, rise. Take thy brethren by your side, and hand in hand for those who ascended to the Almighty's throne. Let us never forget those lost and unknown. The inspiration for this poem was while I was an artist in residence in the fall of 2021 in Manassas, Virginia. This photograph you see was a photograph I actually took and have used as part of this program. As I stopped along that trail on that fall day, I remember that the silence of the forest and the creek caused me to stop and listen. Yes, I listened to the silent perfection of that moment. It was standing still in time, and the forest with all that beauty and the magnificence all around me. In that moment, it came to me that I was there for all those unknown soldiers who fought and died without a name or a face or even a trace, thinking of them and all of them laying in graves with only unknown to mark their presence on earth. The moment overwhelmed me. The songs of their souls with no name and no face inspired me to create the poem, Rise Up, All Ye Manassas, Rise. And in that silent contemplation of that moment, I wondered again of the horror of the fighting and suffering of all the soldiers and civilians in all our Civil War battlefields. It is for them and all of those who are known, this collection is dedicated, for when we remember them, they live again. And I'd also like to share with you that the poem and the photograph is hanging in the Manassas National Battlefield Park Visitor Center. This was my gift to them post residency, so you can actually go and see it hanging there. And I would like to conclude here today with the words of our great American poet Walt Whitman and this excerpt from The Million Dead of 1865. These words capture completely the essence of all our nameless and faceless of the Civil War. The Million Dead, 1865, by Walt Whitman. The dead, the dead, the dead. Our dead, for south or north, ours all. Our young men, once so handsome and so joyous, taken from us, the son from the mother, the husband from the wife, the dear friend from the dear friend. And everywhere among these countless graves, we see, and ages yet may see, on monuments and gravestones, singly or in masses, the thousands or tens of thousands, the significant word. Unknown. Thank you all very much.